He looked at me across the kitchen table we'd bought together at a flea market when we were 24, and he said the following words in the voice of a man explaining something to someone who should already understand it. "You've let yourself go, Maya. It's not just the weight, it's the whole package. You have no ambition anymore. You don't fit the life I'm building." He said that to the woman who dropped out of college in her junior year to be at his hospital bedside, to the woman who cleaned office floors on her knees at 3 a.m. to pay for his surgeries, to the woman who literally carried his 6'2" body from the wheelchair to the bed, from the bed to the bathroom, from the bathroom back to the bed, every night for 5 years, until her lower back developed the kind of damage that takes a decade to fully forgive. He said I had no ambition. I want to tell you what I did about it. But first, I need to take you back to the night it started, because I need you to understand exactly who I was before any of this happened, and exactly what I chose to sacrifice, so that when I tell you what came next, you understand the full weight of what he threw away. My name is Maya, and this is the story of the most expensive lesson a man ever tried to make me pay for. I want you to understand who James was before the accident, not because it excuses anything, but because the story doesn't make sense without it. James Whittemore was the kind of man who walked into rooms differently than other people, not arrogantly, or not only arrogantly. There was a quality to his presence that was genuinely compelling, the quality of someone who had decided at a young age that the world was going to take him seriously and proceeded to arrange the evidence accordingly. He was 31 when the accident happened. He had an MBA, a management consulting job that paid enough to make other people slightly uncomfortable discussing salaries, and a 5-year plan that he kept in a leather portfolio in the top left drawer of his desk and updated quarterly. I had met him when I was 22 at the kind of graduate school party that people go to because they want to meet people at graduate school parties rather than because they want to be at a party. I was 3 years behind him, still in my undergraduate program, studying business administration, working 2 part-time jobs to cover what my scholarship didn't. I had a 5-year plan too, though mine was written in a composition notebook with a cracked spine and involved finishing my degree, paying off my student loans, and eventually opening a small retail business, something with a physical space, something I could stand inside of and feel the specific satisfaction of having built. We dated for 2 years. We argued about small things and agreed on large ones. We moved in together in a 1-bedroom apartment that was too expensive and exactly the right size. We talked about marriage in the abstract way people in their mid-20s talk about it. Not a plan yet, but an agreed-upon destination. He proposed on a Saturday in October at the flea market where we found the kitchen table, and I said yes with paint chips from a previous purchase still on my hands, and it was not the proposal either of us would have designed in advance, and it was perfect. We got married the following June. In the ceremony, we said the standard words, the ancient words, the ones people have been saying in one form or another for as long as human beings have been trying to formalize what it means to choose someone, in sickness and in health, for richer, for poorer, until death do us part. James said them in his clear, carrying voice, looking directly at me. I believed him. The accident happened 18 months after the wedding, a Tuesday in February. James was driving back from a client dinner. He was not drinking, I want to be clear about that, because it matters to the specific cruelty of what happened later, when a driver who had been drinking ran a red light at 47 miles per hour and struck the passenger side of James's car. I was at home. I was studying. I was still in my undergraduate program, taking evening classes around my jobs, when the phone rang, and the voice on the other end of the phone was a woman who identified herself as a trauma nurse at St. Catherine's Medical Center, and who asked me with professional kindness if I was the emergency contact listed for a James Whittemore. The drive to the hospital took 11 minutes. I know this because I have a very clear memory of looking at the clock on the dashboard when I turned the key in the ignition, and looking at the clock again when I pulled into the hospital parking structure, and the space between those two times was 11 minutes, and I have wondered sometimes what I was thinking during those 11 minutes, and the honest answer is that I don't know. I don't think I was thinking, I think I was driving. The doctor who came to speak to me in the waiting room was a spinal surgeon named Anita Reyes. She was a small woman with an extraordinarily precise manner of speaking, each sentence exact, nothing wasted, and she told me about the fracture to James's T10 vertebrae, and about the spinal cord contusion, and about the phrase incomplete injury, which she explained meant that there was damage, but not complete severance, which meant that recovery was not impossible, but that it was also not something she could promise. She said, "The honest answer is that we don't know yet. The next 6 months will tell us more than I can tell you tonight." She said, "He's going to need surgery, and after surgery, he's going to need extensive rehabilitation. This will be a long road." She said years, and I nodded, and she shook my hand, and I sat back down in the plastic chair in the waiting room and looked at the wall across from me and thought, okay, that is the only word I can give you for what I was thinking. Okay, this is what is happening. Okay, now figure out what comes next. I think that is either the bravest thing or the most naive thing about the person I was at 24. I didn't fully understand, sitting in that plastic chair on a Tuesday night in February, that okay was the beginning of 5 years of my life. I thought it was a crisis with a timeline. I thought there would be a hardest part, and then a less hard part, and something that looked like before. I did not understand that there is no before after a certain kind of before. I just thought, okay, now figure out what comes next. James had the first surgery 11 days after the accident. The second surgery was 6 weeks after the first, to address complications from bone fragment migration that Dr. Reyes had anticipated but hoped to avoid. The third surgery was 4 months in, a procedure to stabilize 2 adjacent vertebrae that had shown stress fractures on the follow-up imaging. 3 surgeries in 4 months. The medical bills arrived the way all devastating financial news arrives, in increments, in envelopes with transparent windows, each one somehow both expected and a shock. The first was $47,000, the second $31,000, the third $89,000. These were after insurance. James's employer sponsored insurance, which was good insurance, genuinely good, but which had an out-of-pocket maximum that we reached after the first surgery, and which still left the remainder of each bill to accumulate in a folder I kept on the kitchen counter, because I couldn't bring myself to put it in a drawer. I took the first loan out in March. It was $60,000, secured against nothing I owned of value, at a rate that was punishing for someone with my income and credit history. The loan officer was professional and kind, in the way that loan officers are kind when they are extending money they know will be difficult to repay, which is to say they were kind in a way that cost them nothing. James's consulting firm held his position for 3 months, a generosity that I have never stopped being grateful for, because it bought us time that we would not otherwise have had. After 3 months, they restructured. His position was eliminated. He had a small severance and a disability insurance policy that covered 60% of his pre-disability income, which would have been comfortable if we had been living comfortably, and which was not remotely sufficient for what we were facing. I need to tell you what my days looked like, because I think the details matter more than the summary. I was 24 years old. I got up at 5:30 in the morning to get James ready for his weekday rehabilitation sessions. This involved helping him with personal hygiene, making sure his medications were organized, and getting him into the adapted van that we had purchased used for $12,000 with money from a second loan, and that I had taught myself to drive in a parking lot the week we bought it, because it drove differently from a regular vehicle, and I didn't want to be uncertain when James was in it. I dropped him at rehab at 7:30. At 8 o'clock, I was at my first job, which was a data entry position at a medical billing company that I had gotten because the schedule was flexible and because I had mentioned in the interview, with a precision of honesty that felt like a gamble, that I was managing a family medical situation and needed the ability to occasionally take phone calls. The woman who interviewed me looked at me for a moment and then said, "We've all had those situations." She hired me. I worked there from 8 until 4. From 4:30 until 9 I worked at a pharmacy, first as a cashier, and then, after I passed a certification exam I studied for in the rehab waiting room and the hospital cafeteria, as a pharmacy technician. The certification meant $4 more per hour, which over a 40-hour week was a significant number, and I have never been prouder of a piece of paper. The third job was the one that I don't talk about easily, not because I am ashamed of it, I am not, I want to be absolutely clear, but because explaining it to people requires a certain patience with their reaction, which is usually a kind of horrified sympathy that I find exhausting. 3 nights a week, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, I worked from 10 at night till 4 in the morning as part of a commercial cleaning crew that serviced 3 office buildings in downtown Minneapolis. We cleaned floors, we emptied waste bins, we cleaned bathrooms. We moved through those buildings in the particular silence of people working in a space that is not meant for them, restoring it to a version of itself that the people who worked there during the day would never notice because the restoration was invisible. That is the nature of maintenance work. It is most successful when it leaves no evidence of itself. I wore knee pads because without them my knees could not sustain the work. I wore them for 2 years before I admitted to myself that my knees hurt even with them. The smell of that work was bleach and floor wax, and the particular recycled air quality of buildings sealed for the night. I know that smell the way I know the smell of James's hospital room in the first weeks, which was antiseptic and something else underneath it that I don't have a name for, but that I associate entirely with fear. I know the smell of the rehab facility's therapy room, which was rubber and exertion, and the industrial-grade carpet cleaner they used on Wednesdays. I know the smell of 3 in the morning in an office building when the cleaning cart's wheels squeak slightly on the linoleum and the fluorescent lights hum at a frequency that after a few months you stop hearing consciously, but that lives in the base of your skull. I slept on those 3 nights from 4:30 in the morning till 7, 2.5 hours, for 2 years. Then I would get up and get James ready for rehabilitation. I want to tell you about a specific Tuesday in December of the second year. James had had a difficult week. His progress in rehabilitation had plateaued, which Dr. Reyes had warned us would happen, and which was happening, one of the most demoralizing experiences I had witnessed. He had some sensation in both legs, but no reliable motor control, and the plateau meant that the feeling that things were moving forward, however slowly, had been replaced by a stillness that was psychologically very different from progress, even if it wasn't technically regression. He was angry. Not always, and not without reason, but in that period the anger arrived unpredictably, at small things, and I had learned to navigate around it like you navigate around an obstacle that doesn't move, carefully, consistently, without drama. That Tuesday, I came home from the cleaning shift at 4:15 in the morning to find that James had knocked his water glass off the nightstand in the night, and he couldn't reach the light switch to turn on the lamp. The water had soaked into the rug beside the bed. He was awake, in the dark, in the wet, and he was not fine. I cleaned up the water, I changed the rug, I got him a fresh glass and his medications, and I sat on the edge of the bed and I rubbed his calves, not because there was reliable sensation there yet, but because the physical therapist had said movement and circulation mattered, and because it was something I could do, and he eventually fell asleep. I did not. I sat in the kitchen at 4:45 in the morning, and I looked at the folder on the counter, the bills, always the bills, and I added up the current running total in my head the way I did sometimes when I couldn't sleep, because the numbers had become a kind of litany. $247,000 at that point, in additional debt beyond the disability insurance. $247,000. I had no college degree. I was working 3 jobs. My lower back had developed a chronic ache from the lifting that I was managing with ibuprofen at doses that I knew were not recommended long-term, but that I could not afford to address properly because addressing it properly would mean a doctor's appointment, and a doctor's appointment would mean time I didn't have. I sat at the kitchen table at 4:45 in the morning, and I thought very clearly, I am not going to break. Not because I was certain I wouldn't, but because I had decided. In 5 years, I took out 4 personal loans, 2 home equity lines of credit against the small house James had owned before we married, and that was now technically half mine, 1 medical credit line at a rate that should be illegal, and that was at the time the only option available to me. Total medical debt at the end of 5 years, $312,000. I want you to hold that number, because James's attorney will try to tell you later in this story that it was a shared debt, and I need you to remember who made it. I also need to tell you one more thing about those 5 years, because it matters to what comes later. I did not stop loving James. I want to be precise about this, because it is both the most important and the most complicated truth in the story. I was exhausted. I was sometimes resentful in the deep, unspoken way of someone who cannot afford to be resentful and so carries it silently. I grieved the degree I didn't finish, the business I didn't start, the particular version of 24 and 25 and 26 that I didn't get to have. But I did not stop loving the man in that bed. I need you to understand that, so you understand the full weight of Chapter 4. Month 37. That is when the shift happened. The rehabilitation team had been honest with us throughout. Dr. Reyes's particular gift was precision, and her precision meant that she did not offer false hope, but also did not foreclose on real possibility. And over 3 years, the real possibility had been slowly, unevenly, stubbornly assembling itself into something that looked increasingly like progress. James had regained sensation in both legs by year 2. He had begun bearing limited weight by month 28. He had begun moving, with assistance, with braces, with a walker, with the specific determination of a man whose whole identity was built on being competent, and who had found in the rehabilitation process something that the accident had not entirely destroyed, by month 33. In month 37, on a Wednesday afternoon in the physical therapy room at the Lakeside Rehabilitation Center, with 2 therapists flanking him, and me standing at the end of the parallel bars, and Dr. Reyes with her clipboard and her precise face, trying and largely failing to contain something that looked like pride, James Whitmore walked to the end of the parallel bars without assistance, 8 steps, unassisted. I cried in a way that I have not cried before or since, not the crying of grief, which I had done privately and quietly for 3 years, but the crying of something being released that has been held at enormous cost for an enormous time, and the release is so sudden and so complete that the body doesn't know what to do with the absence of the weight. James cried too. He reached the end of the parallel bars, and I went to him, and he held me, really held me, with his arms around me and his face in my neck, and his weight a real and present thing, and he said against my hair, "I don't know how you did this. I don't know how you held all of this together." I said, "We held it together." He said, "No, you did. I know what you did, Maya. I know." I believe it meant it then. I believe that in that moment in the physical therapy room in month 37, James Whitmore looked at me with complete clarity and saw the woman who had carried his life for 3 years and felt genuinely and without qualification an enormous gratitude. I believe it because I was watching his face. I believe it because I knew his face as well as I knew my own. And I believe it because what came later, the coldness, the distance, the gradual retracting of warmth that I noticed first as a slight change in temperature and then as something starker, that came later. It was not there yet in month 37. It took another 14 months to arrive fully. During that 14 months, James continued to recover. He progressed from a walker to forearm crutches to a single cane. He went from physical therapy 3 times a week to twice a week to a maintenance program he could largely do independently. He began working with a vocational counselor about returning to professional life, which I encouraged, which I was genuinely glad about. His work had been central to his identity, and I could see what the forced passivity of illness had cost him in terms of how he felt about himself. He made contact with colleagues, he refreshed his credentials, he did informational interviews with 2 firms and a consulting group. By month 48, 4 years after the accident, he had been offered a position at a strategy consulting firm called Hartwell & Associates, at a salary that was, adjusting for the cost of living increase in those 4 years, roughly equivalent to what he had been making before the accident. The position required him to travel. In the beginning it was once a month, a Tuesday to Thursday, flights to Chicago or New York, or occasionally the West Coast. Then it was twice a month. Then it was more variable, less predictable, the kind of travel schedule that makes a household function around the absence of one person rather than the presence of 2. I adjusted. I was still working, 2 jobs now, having dropped the cleaning shift when James's disability insurance had continued and when the smaller loans had been refinanced into a more manageable single payment. I was managing the household finances, the debt schedule, the insurance paperwork that was still ongoing. I was still, functionally, the operational center of our life together. I noticed during this period that James had begun to dress differently. This sounds like a small thing. It was not. He had always been a careful dresser. It was part of the identity I described at the beginning, the image of competence and capability that he maintained deliberately. But during the illness, the practical necessities of rehabilitation had flattened his wardrobe into comfort and function. Now, returning to professional life, he was rebuilding it. New suits, a personal shopper he mentioned casually once, a gym membership at a facility downtown that catered specifically to professionals and that cost more per month than our first apartment. He started coming home later on the days he was in the office. He started taking calls in the other room, which he described as needing quiet to concentrate, which was entirely plausible, which I accepted, which I now understand I should have examined more carefully. I noticed these things. I filed them in the part of my brain that holds things I am not yet ready to look at directly. I was tired. I had been tired for 5 years. I told myself that he was readjusting to professional life, that the transition was complex, that people who have been through what he had been through need time to find their footing. Month 53. He came home on a Thursday. He'd been traveling, and he put his bag down in the hallway, and he looked at me across the kitchen, and his face had an expression I hadn't seen before, and something in my chest went very quiet. He said, "Can we talk?" "Of course," I said. He sat down at the kitchen table, the flea market table, the one I had found before any of this, the one I had sat at 4:45 in the morning counting bills. He said, "I've been doing a lot of thinking." He had been doing a lot of thinking. I want to give you this conversation in full, because summaries are a kind of mercy, and this conversation does not deserve mercy. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he said, "about where we are, about where I'm going, and I think, Maya, I need to be honest with you, I think we've grown in different directions." I looked at him. "Different directions?" I said. "I've changed. The last 5 years, they changed me. I went through something that forced me to completely reevaluate what I want from my life and what I need around me to be the person I want to be. I said nothing. I was still processing. I need to be surrounded by people who have ambition, who are growing, who inspire me to keep building. He paused. I feel like, and I'm not saying this to be unkind, I feel like you've stood still, Maya. You're not where you were when we met. You've let things go. I've let things go, I repeated. Your career, your goals, he made a gesture, your overall presentation. I know that sounds superficial, and I know the last 5 years have been hard, but I look at the women in my office, the people I'm working with now, and they're driven, they're ambitious, they take care of themselves. I thought about the knee pads I had worn for 2 years. I thought about the bleach smell. I thought about month 37 and what he had said against my hair. I said, James, I dropped out of college to take care of you. He had the grace, or the cowardice, to look briefly uncomfortable. He said, I know, and I'm grateful for everything you did. I want you to know that, but I can't let gratitude be the reason I stay in a marriage that isn't working. He said gratitude, like it was a debt, like what I had done was a transaction that had been noted in a ledger and credited and was now settled. Dread. Is there someone else? I asked. The pause that followed that question was approximately 2 seconds long. In those 2 seconds, I knew. There's someone I've been talking to, a colleague. Nothing has happened, I want to be clear about that, but she understands me in ways that I've been missing. She understands him. After 5 years of my life on my knees on office floors at 3 in the morning, maintaining a home he could come back to, managing debt I had taken on to give him back his legs, he had found someone who understood him. Her name? Another pause. Clara, he said. How long? We've been talking for about 4 months. 4 months. His job was 6 months old. He had been back in professional life for 6 months. 4 of those months had included Clara from the office who understood him. I said nothing for a very long time. Then he said the part that I want you to hold alongside that $312,000 number. I've had my attorney look at the debt situation. The medical debt is in your name primarily, the loans you took out, the lines of credit. He says that since the debt was acquired in your name and you were the primary borrower, it will remain your responsibility in a separation. I looked at him. The debt I took out to pay for your surgeries, I said. Legally, the debt I took out to pay for your surgeries, to pay for 3 years of rehabilitation, to keep this house while you couldn't work, that debt. I understand that it feels unfair. Get out of this kitchen, I said. Not loudly. I did not raise my voice. Maya, I need you to get out of this kitchen before I say something I haven't thought through carefully enough, and I am going to think this through very carefully. I promise you that. He left the kitchen. I sat at the table, the flea market table where he had proposed, and I thought about his attorney, and I thought about my options, and I thought, okay, now figure out what comes next. I spent 3 days in that house after the conversation, 3 days in which James and I maintained the performance of a household in the way people do when the structure has already failed, but the form is still standing. He slept in the guest room. We moved around each other with the careful navigation of 2 people who have said the most important thing and are now managing the silence that follows it. I used those 3 days productively. The first thing I did was call my college friend Renata, who had graduated law school the previous year and was working in a family law firm in St. Paul. I did not ask her to take my case. I knew she couldn't, conflict of interest issues and inexperience both, but I asked her over the phone at 10 at night while James was behind a closed door to tell me what I needed to know. Renata, who has always been the kind of friend that people mean when they talk about people who show up, spent 90 minutes on the phone with me, walking through the basics of marital property law in our state. What she told me restructured my understanding of my situation entirely. Our state is an equitable distribution state, not a community property state, meaning that assets and liabilities in divorce are divided according to what is fair and equitable, not necessarily equally. Equitable, Renata explained, does not mean even. It means the court looks at contributions, financial, domestic, and otherwise, and tries to construct a division that reflects what each party actually brought to the marriage. You sacrificed your education and your career to support his recovery, she said. That is a documented, demonstrable contribution to his current earning capacity. He literally could not be where he is professionally if you hadn't done what you did. I said, he's trying to leave me with the debt. Renata was quiet for a moment. Then she said, he's going to need a very good attorney to pull that off, and you're going to need a better one. The second thing I did was gather information. This is not a comfortable section of the story to narrate because it involved acknowledging that I looked at things I found by looking, and that looking felt like a violation of a privacy I no longer had any reason to protect. But I am going to tell you because the information matters. James travelled with his work laptop. His personal laptop remained on the desk in the home office. We shared a family password manager, an account I had set up during the disability years to manage our insurance portals and financial accounts, because managing 17 different logins with a brain running on 2.5 hours of sleep is not something you do from memory. I did not look at his emails. I looked at the bank accounts, which I had every legal right to access, as I was a joint account holder. What I found there was sufficient. A restaurant charge, $340, at a place I knew was the kind of restaurant James had been going to since returning to professional life, the kind with a wine list in a leather folio and a staff-to-table ratio that ensures discretion. On a Thursday night in October, 3 weeks before our conversation in the kitchen. A jewelry store charge, $1,200, from 2 weeks before our conversation. A hotel charge, from a weekend he had told me was a work retreat, not the kind of hotel you book for a work retreat, the kind you book when you want the evening to be unremarkable and the morning to be private. And in the savings account, our savings account, the one I had contributed precisely $0 from because precisely 100% of my income had gone to debt service for 4 years, a transfer, $15,000, to an account I didn't recognize, dated to the same week he'd told me he'd spoken to his attorney. I looked at that transfer for a long time. He had moved money before filing. I called Renata again. She said, take screenshots, document everything, dates, amounts, everything. I said, he moved money. She said, honey, call the attorney I'm going to text you right now. Her name is Patricia Voss. She's the best divorce attorney in the state, and she has never, in 12 years of practice, lost a case involving dissipated marital assets. I can't afford. She works on contingency in cases with high income potential defendants. Trust me, call her. I called Patricia Voss the next morning. Patricia Voss's office was on the 14th floor of a building downtown, and walking into it felt like walking into a space specifically designed to communicate the following message. Here, precision is the point. She was 53. She had silver hair cut with the same precision she applied to everything else. She wore no jewelry except a watch. She looked at me across her desk with the particular attention of someone who is assessing both what you are telling her and whether you are telling her all of it. I laid out everything on her desk, 5 years of financial records, organized chronologically, the 4 loan agreements, the 2 home equity lines of credit, the medical billing statements, my employment records from all 3 jobs, the rehabilitation facility invoices, the pharmacy receipts, the bank records I had photographed, the retirement account statements, the Social Security earnings records showing the years in which my income had been entirely redirected to debt service. She looked at all of it for a very long time. Then she looked at me. "He filed first," she said. "His attorney sent the initial filing notice 4 days ago. And the debt, he's claiming you hold it personally. His attorney argues the loans were in my name and are my responsibility." Patricia Voss made a sound that was not quite a laugh. It was the sound of someone encountering an argument they find technically possible and factually insulting. "Let me tell you," she said, "what his attorney is hoping you don't know." She opened a legal pad and began to write as she spoke, in the precise shorthand of someone who thinks in organized columns. In this state, debt incurred during the marriage for the benefit of the marriage is marital debt, regardless of whose name it's in. The question is not who signed the papers, the question is who benefited from the expenditure. I said, he benefited. He has his legs because of those loans. Correct, which means we file a motion to reclassify the debt as marital liability and argue that it should be assigned to the party who received the benefit, which is him, demonstrably, provably, with 3 years of medical records and rehabilitation invoices that constitute one of the clearest paper trails I have ever seen in 20 years of practice. I sat with that. What about the asset division? Patricia set down her pen. She looked at me for a moment in the way that I recognized, having spent 5 years around medical professionals, as the look that precedes important information. "Tell me about his career," she said, "before the accident, after, current position." I told her, salary before, $190,000 base, plus performance, 5 years of disability, 6 months back, current salary, $245,000 base. She had seen it in the earnings records. She wrote for a moment. "Your sacrifice," she said, "was not just emotional, it was economically quantifiable. You provided approximately 5 years of full-time caregiving, which, if billed at professional rates for home health aid, skilled nursing support and household management, represents a substantial economic contribution. You also deferred your own education and career development for 5 years, which represents lost earning potential that we can document with expert testimony. But the most important element," she continued, "is this. He returned to a professional career at an income of $245,000 per year. He could not have done that without the physical rehabilitation you funded and facilitated. Your investment, literal financial investment in his recovery, directly enabled his current and future earning capacity." She turned the legal pad toward me. She had written a number. It was the projected spousal support figure, monthly for a period of years, based on the precedent she had already identified in similar cases in our state. I looked at the number. I had been up at 5:30 in the morning for 5 years. I had worn knee pads on an office floor at 3 in the morning. I had taken out $312,000 in debt. I had not broken. I looked at the number Patricia Voss had written on her legal pad, and I thought about James's attorney telling him that the debt would remain mine. "Will he fight this?" I said. Strenuously, she said. He has money for a very good attorney, and his position is not without some technical merit, but our position is better, and our paper trail is extraordinary. She folded her hands on the desk. I have never seen a more documented case of marital contribution. You kept records, the loans, the employment, the rehabilitation invoices. You kept everything. I kept them, I said, because numbers were the only thing I could control. She looked at me for a moment. Good, she said. Let's use them. The mediation took place on a Thursday, 7 weeks after James had filed. The room was neutral. A conference room in a mediation center, long table, white walls, the particular absence of personality that neutral spaces are designed to project. James was across the table from me with his attorney, a man named Clifford Baines, who had the polished confidence of someone accustomed to winning on technical points. Patricia Voss sat beside me, with her legal pad and her silver hair and her watch. James had not looked at me directly when he came in. I had looked at him. I looked at him with the specific attention of someone who is seeing a thing clearly for the first time, not because the thing had changed, but because the perspective had. Baines opened with the debt argument. He was smooth about it. He presented the loan agreements, the line of credit documents, the signature pages with my name on them, and he argued in the fluid, rehearsed cadence of someone who has made this argument before and expects it to land, that the debt was personal, not marital, and should remain with the party who had contracted it. Patricia Voss waited until he was finished. Then she opened her folder. She placed on the table, in a single, organized stack, the following documents: the surgical invoices, 3 of them, total $167,000. The rehabilitation facility invoices, 53 months of weekly and twice-weekly sessions, total $89,000. The home health aid equivalent calculation prepared by a forensic economist documenting the market rate for the care services I had provided and that would otherwise have been contracted professionally. Total projected over 5 years, $210,000. The lost earnings projection, also prepared by the forensic economist, documenting the salary trajectory I would have followed had I completed my degree on schedule and entered the workforce at 23 rather than 29 when I finally graduated, a number I will come back to. Total projected loss over the period, $165,000. The bank records showing the $15,000 transfer James had made after the divorce conversation and before the filing. Baines looked at the stack. He looked at Patricia. He looked at James. Patricia said in the even tone of someone who has spent 20 years winning, "I'd like to walk through each of these documents and explain exactly what they demonstrate, unless Mr. Baines would prefer a brief recess to review them first." Baines said he would like the recess. During the recess, which was 20 minutes, I sat in a chair in the hallway and I drank a cup of coffee from a machine, and I thought about the mediation table and the documents on it and the specific arithmetic of my last 5 years, laid out in organized stacks for a room to examine. I thought about the fact that I had kept every receipt, not because I knew I would need them someday, but because numbers were the only thing I could control. And then I thought about Patricia's number on the legal pad, and I thought, okay. We went back in. Baines had adjusted his position. The negotiation that followed was 2 hours long, and I am going to summarize it, not because the details are important, but because what matters is the outcome, and the outcome was this: the medical debt, All $312,000 of it was reclassified as marital debt and assigned in full to James, on the grounds that the expenditure had directly and demonstrably benefited him, and that his current earning capacity was contingent on the recovery those funds had enabled. The $15,000 transfer was returned to the marital estate and divided. James's half of the home equity, the house that had been his before our marriage, but that I had helped maintain, manage, and keep financially viable for 7 years, was subject to an offset based on my documented contributions to the property during the marriage, and spousal support based on his current income, my demonstrated sacrifice, and the documented disparity in our earning trajectories was set to a figure that would allow me to complete my degree and establish myself professionally without the debt that had been designed to bury me. James did not look at me at the end of the mediation. I did not need him to. I shook Patricia Voss's hand in the parking lot. She said, "You did very well in there." I said, "I kept every receipt." She almost smiled. "Maya," she said, "in 20 years you are one of the clearest cases I have ever seen. You invested everything in a person." The law agreed. I drove home. I turned on the radio. I sat in the quiet of a car that was mine, and a life that was, for the first time in years, beginning to contain only the obligations I had chosen, and I let myself feel it. All of it.